The rescue boat crew saw her first, a dark shape limping across the morning sky, engines coughing black smoke, silhouette wrong in ways that made experienced sailors cross themselves and whisper prayers. She came from the direction of Rabaul, which was impossible. Nothing came back from Rabaul. Not anymore.
Petty Officer Williams raised his binoculars and felt his coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering on the deck unnoticed. "Mother of God," he breathed. The aircraft approaching Henderson Field was a PBY Catalina, the slow, lumbering flying boat that sailors affectionately called the Flying Whale and Japanese pilots called Target Practice. Her hull was perforated with so many holes she looked like she'd been attacked by a giant shotgun. The port engine was trailing fire. The starboard engine was running on what appeared to be pure stubbornness and divine intervention. Her tail section was half gone, fabric and metal peeling away in the wind like dead skin. But she was flying. Somehow, impossibly, she was still flying.
"Get the crash crews ready," Williams shouted, already running toward the shore. "Get medical! Get everyone!" The Catalina, her name, barely visible through the damage, was Lazy Lucy, touched down on the water like a dying swan, graceful even in her final moments. She didn't so much land as collapse onto the surface, her hull groaning, water immediately flooding through the countless holes in her fuselage. Williams was in the first rescue boat to reach her. What he found inside would become legend, whispered in ready rooms and officers' clubs from Guadalcanal to Pearl Harbor. A story so improbable that High Command initially classified it as probable combat stress hallucination.
The crew of 7 was alive, all of them. Wounded, yes, some badly, but alive. The aircraft's interior was ankle-deep in a mixture of seawater, blood, and spent shell casings. Every gun position showed evidence of sustained fire. The ammunition lockers were empty. Not low, empty. But it was the pilot, still strapped into his seat, hands frozen on the controls, who made Williams stop breathing. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Morrison was smiling, a strange, faraway smile that belonged on the face of a man who had just shaken hands with God.
"Sir," Williams said carefully, "can you tell me what happened out there?"
Morrison turned slowly, his eyes focusing with difficulty, as if he was returning from a very great distance. When he spoke, his voice was a hoarse whisper, but his words would echo through history.
"They sent 12 Zeros to kill us, 12 of their best. They were laughing on the radio, taking bets on who would score the kill." He paused, coughing blood into his hand. 9 of them are at the bottom of the ocean now. The other 3 ran away.
He laughed then, a sound that contained no humor, only the wild joy of the survivor. "They thought we were slow. They thought we were helpless. They thought we were dead the moment they found us." His smile widened, bloody teeth showing. "They were wrong about all of it."
This is the true story of Lazy Lucy, the slow bomber that rewrote the rules of aerial combat, and the extraordinary crew who refused to die when every law of aviation said they should.
Pearl Harbor Naval Air Station, October 1942. The new pilots stood on the tarmac, staring at the aircraft that would become their homes, their weapons, and for many of them, their coffins. The PBY Catalina sat on the water like a patient grandmother, her broad wings stretching over 100 feet, her twin engines humming with the gentle reliability of a kitchen appliance. "Gentlemen," announced Commander Richard Hayes, "meet the consolidated PBY 5A Catalina, your new assignment."
The silence that followed was deafening. Lieutenant Samuel Morrison, newly transferred from fighter training, felt his heart sink into his stomach.
"Sir," ventured one brave soul, "isn't this a rescue plane?"
"Patrol bomber," Hayes corrected, though his tone suggested he understood the disappointment. "Reconnaissance, search and rescue, submarine hunting. The Catalina does it all."
"Does it fight?" Morrison asked, the question escaping before he could stop it.
Hayes turned to look at him, a long, measuring gaze. "Lieutenant Morrison,
Fighter pilot washout, am I right? Couldn't handle the wildcats?
Medical disqualification, sir. Vision problems.
Hayes nodded slowly. Well, Lieutenant, to answer your question, the Catalina has a maximum speed of 196 miles per hour. The Japanese Zero can do 350. The Catalina has 3 machine guns, 2 in the waist and 1 in the bow. The Zero has 2 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns. The Catalina's armor consists of prayers and hope. The Zero's pilots have been training since childhood to kill things exactly like the Catalina.
He paused, letting that sink in. Does it fight?
No, Lieutenant. It survives. If you're lucky, if you're good, if God is paying attention that particular day. Your job is not to fight. Your job is to find the enemy, report their position, and get home alive. Clear?
Clear, sir. But as Morrison walked toward the Catalina, this slow, ungainly, impossibly vulnerable aircraft, something stirred in his chest. Not disappointment, something else. The same feeling he'd had as a boy when everyone told him he was too small for football, too poor for college, too unremarkable for anything special.
The feeling of something to prove.
He placed his hand on the Catalina's hull, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingers. "Okay, girl," he whispered. "Everyone thinks you're useless. Everyone thinks you're dead the moment trouble finds you." He smiled grimly. "Let's prove them wrong together."
A crew, Morrison learned quickly, could make or break a Catalina mission. 7 men sealed in a metal tube for 12, sometimes 18 hours at a stretch, flying through hostile skies with nothing but each other to rely on. The Navy, in its infinite wisdom, had assigned him the rejects, the men no one else wanted. His co-pilot was Lieutenant James Jimmy O'Brien, an Irishman from Boston with a drinking problem and a dishonorable discharge from his previous squadron for punching a superior officer. The Navy had given him one last chance. The Catalina was it.
"They say these things fly like pregnant elephants," O'Brien observed during their first meeting, his breath carrying the faint whiff of whiskey. "That true?" "Probably," Morrison admitted. "You have a problem with that?"
O'Brien shrugged. "I've made my peace with dying, Commander. Makes everything else pretty simple." It wasn't the most encouraging introduction, but Morrison saw something in the Irishman's eyes, a steadiness beneath the bravado, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear.
The flight engineer was Petty Officer First Class Benjamin Washington, a black man from Alabama, who was, officially, not supposed to be anywhere near an aircraft. The Navy's racial policies were clear. Colored personnel served in mess halls and engine rooms, not in combat crews. But Washington had a gift for machinery that bordered on the supernatural, and some desperate squadron commander had quietly reassigned him to Catalina maintenance, then, when no one was looking, to active flight duty.
"They'll court-martial someone if they find out about me," Washington said matter-of-factly when Morrison questioned him about his situation. "Probably you. Maybe me too. You want me off the crew?"
Morrison looked at the man's service record, the machines he'd kept running, the engines he'd nursed back to life, the impossible repairs he'd performed with nothing but intuition and willpower. "Can you keep this flying coffin in the air when everything goes to hell?"
"Commander, I can keep a dead horse running if you give me enough wire and a prayer." "Then welcome aboard."
The gunners were perhaps the strangest collection of all. Chief Petty Officer Tanaka was a Japanese-American from California, a Nisei, whose family had been interned at Manzanar while he was allowed to serve in the military, though only in positions where he couldn't possibly be accused of espionage. The irony of a Japanese-American manning guns that might one day kill Japanese pilots was not lost on anyone, least of all Tanaka himself.
"I'm American," he said simply when Morrison asked how he felt about his situation. "My parents are American. We've been American for 40 years. What Japan does has nothing to do with me. But if you're asking whether I can pull the trigger when the time comes," he met Morrison's eyes steadily, "I can, and I will."
Gunner's mate Second Class Rodriguez was a Mexican-American from Texas who had been a competitive shooter before the war, good enough for the Olympics if the Olympics hadn't been canceled. He'd been assigned to the Catalina because someone had looked at his test scores and concluded he was too valuable to waste on a fighter, where he might die quickly, but not valuable enough to protect from the meat grinder of patrol duty.
The navigator was Ensign David Goldstein, a Jewish intellectual from New York who had been studying mathematics at Columbia before the war. He could calculate position, wind drift, and fuel consumption in his head faster than most men could read a chart. But his slight build and bookish demeanor had earned him merciless mockery from the physical specimens who dominated naval aviation.
Finally, there was the radio man, Seaman First Class Patrick "Patty" Murphy, a ginger-haired teenager from rural Minnesota who had lied about his age to enlist. He was 17 years old, too young to vote, too young to drink, not too young to die.
7 men, 7 rejects, 1 slow, defenseless aircraft.
"Gentlemen," Morrison said, addressing them for the first time as a complete crew, "I won't lie to you. We've been given the assignments no one else wants, the dangerous routes, the impossible missions. High Command expects us to fail. They expect us to die."
He paused, looking each man in the eye. "I have no intention of meeting those expectations. We may be flying the slowest, most vulnerable aircraft in the Pacific. We may be the crew nobody believes in. But I believe in something they don't." He pointed at the Catalina floating serenely nearby. "That aircraft doesn't know it's supposed to die, and neither do we." O'Brien raised an imaginary glass. "To ignorance, then."
To ignorance, the others echoed, with varying degrees of irony and hope.
In the months that followed, they would forge those words into a battle cry.
The first 3 months were education by fire. Morrison flew mission after mission, 18-hour patrols that turned the crew into zombies, search and rescue operations in shark-infested waters, reconnaissance flights that brushed dangerously close to Japanese-held territory. They learned the Catalina's quirks and capabilities, her moods and mysteries.
They learned that she handled like a bathtub with wings, sluggish, unresponsive, requiring inputs planned minutes in advance. But they also learned that she was incredibly stable, a platform so steady that Rodriguez could place shots with almost sniper-like precision from her waist guns. They learned that her low speed, while a death sentence in a straight fight, made her surprisingly maneuverable at low altitude. Whereas Zero would stall and crash trying to match her slow turns, the Catalina could pirouette like a dancer, if her pilot had the nerve to push her that hard. They learned that Washington could perform miracles. When the starboard engine caught fire during a patrol and standard procedure called for immediate water landing, Washington crawled out onto the wing in flight, and somehow extinguished the flames and got the engine running again. Commander Hayes, reviewing the report, simply wrote "impossible" in the margins and filed it without further comment. And they learned that Morrison had a gift. Other Catalina pilots flew safe and careful, treating their aircraft like the fragile eggs they were. Morrison flew like a man possessed, not recklessly, but aggressively, pushing into the margins where other pilots feared to go. He developed tactics no training manual had ever considered. "If we're attacked," he told his crew during one of their nightly strategy sessions, "conventional wisdom says run, dive for the water, try to outmaneuver, pray for rescue. But that's what they expect. That's what they've trained for. Every Zero pilot knows how to kill a running Catalina." "So what do we do instead?" O'Brien asked. "Fight back? With 3 machine guns against cannons?" "With 3 machine guns, 7 sets of eyes, and the one thing they'll never expect." Morrison smiled grimly. "Aggression. We don't run, we don't hide. We turn into them, make them come at us from angles they haven't practiced. We make them fight our fight, not theirs."
"That's insane," Goldstein said quietly.
"Probably," Morrison agreed, "but insane might keep us alive. Conventional certainly won't." They practiced. Hour after hour, they rehearsed scenarios, coordinating fire between gun positions, executing maneuvers that would have given their instructors heart attacks, developing a silent language of hand signals and intuitive responses. The Catalina became an extension of their collective will,
responding to their intentions almost before they formed them.
Other crews thought they were crazy. Command thought they were a disciplinary problem waiting to happen. But the missions kept succeeding. The intelligence kept flowing. The crew of Lazy Lucy, they had named her after O'Brien's grandmother, a woman who had survived the Irish famine by sheer stubborn refusal to die, kept coming home.
Until March 1943, when they flew into hell itself.
Gentlemen, what I'm about to tell you does not leave this room. Hayes waited for the nods of acknowledgement before continuing. Intelligence has identified a significant Japanese naval buildup at Rabaul. Carriers, battleships, the works. If this force deploys, it could cut off our supply lines to Guadalcanal and throw the entire Pacific campaign into jeopardy.
He tapped the map at Rabaul, the most heavily defended Japanese base in the South Pacific, ringed with anti-aircraft batteries and fighter squadrons.
We need eyes on that harbor, photographic confirmation of what's there, and we need it before dawn tomorrow, when the cloud cover breaks and they'll have clear skies for any operation they're planning.
Sir, ventured one of the other pilots, Rabaul is suicide. Nothing gets in or out of there alive.
Nothing fast, Hayes corrected. Their radar is tuned for high-altitude bombers and fighters. A slow aircraft, flying low, at night, might slip through the gaps. He paused. Might.
His eyes found Morrison. This is a volunteer mission. I won't order anyone to fly it. But if someone were willing to try, the ideal aircraft would be something slow enough to avoid radar detection, sturdy enough to absorb damage, and crewed by men either brave enough or crazy enough to attempt the impossible.
The implication hung in the air like smoke.
Morrison felt his crew's eyes on him. He thought about everything they'd survived, everything they'd proven. He thought about the men on Guadalcanal who would die if the Japanese fleet sailed undetected. He thought about his own mortality and found, somewhat to his surprise, that it didn't frighten him as much as failure did.
Lazy Lucy can do it, sir.
No, sir. But certainty is for people with better options. He stood, his crew rising with him in a single motion. We'll get you your photographs, one way or another.
Hayes nodded slowly. You launch at 2200 hours. May God go with you, because no one else can.
As the crew filed out, O'Brien fell into step beside Morrison. You know this is probably a one-way trip.
I know.
And you volunteered us anyway.
I did.
O'Brien was silent for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Good. I was getting bored anyway. He clapped Morrison on the shoulder. Let's go give those Japanese bastards something to remember us by.
They launched at 2200 hours, Lazy Lucy rising from the dark waters of Henderson Field like a ghost departing the world of the living. The night was moonless, a blessing for stealth, a curse for navigation. Goldstein hunched over his charts, calculating their course by dead reckoning in star fixes, guiding them toward a destination none of them expected to return from.
For 3 hours, they flew in silence, skimming just above the wave tops to avoid Japanese radar. The engine's drone became hypnotic, almost peaceful. It was easy to forget, in moments like this, that they were flying toward the most dangerous place in the Pacific.
At 1:30, Patty Murphy's young voice crackled through the intercom. Radio traffic ahead, Commander. Japanese frequencies. Lots of it.
Can you make out what they're saying?
Tanaka's working on it, sir.
There was a pause, then Tanaka's calm voice. Standard patrol communications. They're not looking for us specifically, but there's a lot of activity. They're expecting something.
Not us, Morrison said with grim satisfaction. Not yet.
They reached the outer perimeter of Rabaul's defenses at 02:15. Morrison took the Catalina lower still until the prop wash was kicking spray from the wave tops. Any lower and they'd be submarines instead of aircraft. Above them, invisible in the darkness, searchlights swept the sky in lazy patterns, hunting for enemies at altitudes Lazy Lucy had no intention of visiting.
There, Goldstein whispered, pointing through the bow windows. Harbor entrance, 2 miles.
Morrison could see it now, the dark shape of the harbor mouth,
lit occasionally by the glow of signal lamps and the distant flicker of anti-aircraft positions. And beyond it, shadows within shadows, the unmistakable silhouettes of warships. Lots of warships.
"Camera ready?" he asked.
Ready, sir. Rodriguez had jury-rigged a reconnaissance camera to fire through one of the observation blisters. It wasn't elegant, but it would work.
"Then let's go shotting."
Lazy Lucy crept into Rabaul Harbor like a thief entering a sleeping giant's bedroom. Morrison held his breath, certain that at any moment the night would explode with gunfire and searchlights. But the darkness held. The Japanese, supremely confident in their defenses against conventional attack, had never imagined that anyone would be foolish enough to simply waltz in at wave-top height.
For 20 incredible minutes, they photographed everything. Carriers, 3 of them, more than intelligence had suspected. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, troop transports, an invasion fleet, assembled and waiting. Morrison felt ice in his veins as he understood what they were looking at. Enough firepower to sweep the Americans out of the Solomon Islands entirely.
"Got it all," Rodriguez reported. "Every ship in the harbor."
Then let's get the hell out of here.
Morrison brought Lazy Lucy around in a gentle turn, heading for the harbor mouth and the open ocean beyond. They were going to make it. Against all odds, they had penetrated the most heavily defended base in the Japanese Pacific. And
"Contact?" Washington's voice was sharp. "Patrol boat, starboard side, 500 yards.
Morrison's blood froze. Through the darkness, he could just make out the shape of a Japanese patrol vessel, its bow pointed directly at them. For an eternal second, nothing happened. Then a searchlight blazed to life, its beam sweeping toward them like the finger of an angry god.
"They've seen us," O'Brien breathed.
The night exploded. Sirens wailed across the harbor. Searchlights stabbed upward from every direction. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with tracers and explosions. Though most of them were aimed too high, the gunners couldn't believe any aircraft would be flying this low.
"Gunners, stand by!" Morrison shouted, pushing the throttles to maximum. Lazy Lucy surged forward with all the acceleration of an arthritic turtle. "We're leaving, whether they like it or not."
Behind them, the radio crackled with Japanese voices. Tanaka translated in real time. "Aircraft in the harbor. All fighters scramble. Destroy the intruder." Morrison checked his watch. Dawn was still 2 hours away. They had 150 miles of open ocean between them and friendly territory. And somewhere behind them, the fastest, deadliest fighters in the Japanese arsenal were spinning up their engines, preparing to hunt.
The race for survival had begun.
They had been flying for 37 minutes when Patty Murphy's voice came through the intercom, unnaturally calm for a 17-year-old about to die. "Bogies, sir. Coming in fast from the northeast. I count 12, sir. 12 aircraft."
12 zeros. 12 of Japan's finest fighters, each capable of speeds nearly double what Lazy Lucy could achieve, each armed with enough firepower to tear the Catalina apart in seconds, against 3 machine guns and a hull made of prayers.
For a moment, Morrison allowed himself to feel the weight of it. They were dead. The mathematics were irrefutable. 12 against 1, fast against slow, cannon against rifle. No Catalina had ever survived such odds. None ever would.
Then he pushed the thought aside. Mathematics were for people who had surrendered.
All hands, battle stations. Washington, I need everything those engines can give me. Gunners, hold fire until I give the word. We're gonna do this my way.
"And what way is that, sir?" O'Brien asked, checking his service pistol, a futile gesture, but somehow comforting.
The way they're not expecting.
Through the cockpit windows, Morrison could now see them, dark shapes against the pre-dawn gray, arrowing toward Lazy Lucy with the confidence of predators approaching wounded prey. He imagined he could hear their radio chatter, the jokes, the bets, the casual certainty of easy victory, the slow bomber, the flying coffin, target practice. Standard Catalina doctrine dictated an immediate descent to wave-top height, presenting the smallest possible target while racing for friendly air cover,
that was impossibly far away. It was the smart play, the safe play, the play that Japanese pilots had practiced countering 1,000 times.
Morrison did the opposite.
Full climb, he ordered, pulling back on the yoke. Take us to 3,000 feet.
Sir? O'Brien's voice cracked with disbelief. That's suicide. They'll have all the altitude advantage.
Trust me. Lazy Lucy groaned as she began her climb, engines straining against gravity, airframe shuddering with the effort. The Zeros, seeing this inexplicable behavior, adjusted their approach. Morrison could imagine their confusion. The Catalina was supposed to run. It was supposed to hide. Instead, it was climbing toward them.
The first Zero began its attack run, diving from above, the classic approach, using altitude as energy, converting height into speed. Morrison watched it come, tracking its descent with an almost supernatural calm.
Hold fire, he said quietly. Hold.
The Zero's guns lit up, tracers arcing toward the Catalina. Morrison felt the aircraft shudder as rounds punched through the fuselage, but the angle was wrong, the shots going high. The Zero pilot, expecting his target to dive or evade, had aimed where a running Catalina should have been, not where Lazy Lucy actually was.
Now! Morrison screamed, and simultaneously threw the Catalina into a maneuver that no flying boat should have been capable of, a snap roll to the left, dropping the nose, presenting the Zero, now overshooting, committed to its dive, with a perfect crossing shot.
Rodriguez didn't hesitate. The starboard waist gun roared, a stream of .50 caliber rounds reaching out toward the Japanese fighter like an angry fist. The Zero, unable to maneuver at its dive speed, flew directly into the stream.
The impact was spectacular. Rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage, shattering the canopy, destroying the engine, igniting the fuel tanks. The fighter exploded in midair, debris spiraling past Lazy Lucy, close enough to touch.
Holy Mother of God, O'Brien breathed. You got him. You actually got him.
Morrison didn't respond. He was already looking for the next threat, because 11 more Zeros were out there, and they had just witnessed something that should have been impossible.
The slow bomber had drawn first blood.
What followed was the longest hour in the lives of every man aboard Lazy Lucy, an hour that would become legend, studied in flight schools for generations, dissected by tacticians who could never quite explain how any of it was possible.
The remaining 11 Zeros regrouped, their initial shock transforming into fury. They had come to execute a helpless target. Instead, they had witnessed a comrade explode. Japanese pilots did not take such insults lightly. The radio chatter Tanaka translated shifted from casual mockery to grim determination.
"They're coming again," he reported. 4 from the front, 3 from each side, 1 from behind. Full encirclement.
Good, Morrison said, and meant it. They're angry now. Angry pilots make mistakes.
The second attack came in waves. 2 Zeros dove from above, guns blazing, while 2 more swept in from the sides to catch the Catalina in a crossfire. It was a textbook maneuver, one that should have torn Lazy Lucy apart. But Morrison had anticipated it. As the diving Zeros opened fire, he pushed the yoke forward, dropping the Catalina into a steep descent. The rounds passed through the space she had just occupied. At the same moment, he rolled right, a banking turn that exposed the belly of the aircraft to the port side attackers, but brought the starboard gunners to bear on the Zeros approaching from that direction.
Tanaka, manning the bowgun, opened fire on the lead Zero in the diving pair. His rounds found the engine, and the fighter began trailing smoke. Not a kill, but a wound. The pilot would have to break off or risk losing power entirely.
Rodriguez, meanwhile, was tracking the starboard attacker with almost mechanical precision. He waited, 1 second, 2, until the Zero was committed to its approach, unable to maneuver without stalling. Then he fired. A short burst, barely 30 rounds. Enough.
The Zero's wings separated from its fuselage as if sliced by an invisible sword. The fighter tumbled end over end, its pilot's scream lost in the howl of torn metal,
and struck the ocean in a fountain of white spray.
2 down, O'Brien counted, his voice carrying a note of hysterical wonder. 2 kills, and we're still flying.
Stay focused, Morrison snapped. 9 more.
The attacks continued, relentless and furious. The Japanese pilots, unable to believe that a slow bomber was doing this to them, made mistake after mistake, approaching too fast, committing too early, underestimating the precision of gunners who had trained for exactly these moments. And Morrison exploited every error.
He flew Lazy Lucy like no Catalina had ever been flown, rolling, diving, climbing, presenting angles that should have been impossible, turning the aircraft's very slowness into an asset. The Zeros, designed for speed, couldn't match her tight turns without stalling. They would flash past, overshooting, suddenly finding themselves in front of guns that should never have had the chance to aim at them.
The third Zero fell at 0547, caught by a burst from the tail position that Washington had rigged with a salvaged machine gun. The pilot ejected, but his parachute failed to open. The fourth and fifth fell together at 0552, victims of a trap Morrison had spent 30 seconds constructing, a feigned engine failure that brought 2 fighters in close for what they thought would be an easy kill, only to discover that the Catalina's dead engine roared back to life at the last moment, swinging the aircraft into a position where both waist guns could engage simultaneously.
By 0600, the Japanese flight leader had lost half his squadron. His radio transmissions, translated by Tanaka, had shifted from anger to something approaching fear.
They're calling for reinforcements, Tanaka reported. He's telling base that they're fighting a demon, that the slow bomber cannot be killed.
Good, Morrison said, teeth bared in something that wasn't quite a smile. Let them think we're demons. Let them be afraid. But fear, he knew, cuts both ways. Inside Lazy Lucy, the cost of survival was mounting. The aircraft had taken dozens of hits. Fuel leaked from ruptured tanks. The starboard engine was running rough, its temperature gauge climbing toward the red. Washington had already performed 2 in-flight repairs that should have been impossible, and his toolkit was nearly exhausted.
Worse, the crew was bleeding. Paddy Murphy had taken shrapnel to the arm. Not fatal, but his young face was pale with shock. Goldstein had a gash across his forehead from a fragment of shattered glass. Even Rodriguez, seemingly invincible at his gun, was nursing cracked ribs from a near miss that had thrown him against the bulkhead.
They were winning, impossibly, incredibly, but they couldn't win forever.
At 6:23, disaster finally found them. A Zero, approaching from below, an angle Morrison hadn't covered, raked Lazy Lucy's belly with cannon fire. The 20mm rounds tore through the hull like paper, destroying the navigation station, killing the radio equipment, and sending Goldstein flying across the compartment with a scream.
Goldstein, Morrison shouted. I'm alive. The navigator's voice was pain-filled but present. Legs broken. I can't move. But I'm alive.
The Zero banked for another pass. This time, there would be no escape. Morrison was out of tricks, out of altitude, out of time. The fighter came in straight and level, its pilot finally patient, finally controlled, lining up for a shot that would end this impossible battle once and for all.
And then Tanaka did something extraordinary.
The Japanese-American gunner, seeing the approaching fighter through his bow position, keyed the radio, the emergency backup that still functioned, and began speaking. In Japanese.
His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather with an old friend. Morrison couldn't understand the words, but he could see the effect. The attacking Zero wobbled, its approach suddenly uncertain. The pilot's hand hesitated on the trigger.
"What are you telling him?" Morrison demanded.
"I'm telling him about my grandmother," Tanaka replied, never taking his eyes off the approaching fighter. "She came from Osaka, same as his squadron patch indicates. I'm telling him that she made the best mochi in San Francisco, and that she would be ashamed to see Japanese pilots struggling to kill a slow bomber flown by misfits and rejects."
You're trying to distract him?
I'm trying to make him understand that I'm not his enemy. Tanaka's finger tightened on his gun trigger. But if he makes me kill him, that's his choice. The Zero pilot made his choice. His guns lit up, tracers reaching toward the Catalina. But the hesitation had cost him. His angle was off, his aim disrupted by the unexpected voice in his earphones. Most of his rounds went wide. Most. Not all. Tanaka's body jerked as a round found his shoulder. But he didn't fall. He didn't stop. With his remaining good arm, he depressed the trigger and held it, pouring fire into the Zero as it passed overhead, so close that Morrison could see the whites of the pilot's eyes. The fighter's canopy shattered. The aircraft rolled inverted, smoke trailing from its engine, and dove toward the ocean in a spiral that would never end.
6, Tanaka gasped, slumping against his gun. 6 kills. Still not your enemy. He passed out. Washington, abandoning his engine station, rushed forward to apply pressure to the wound. He'll live, the engineer announced after a tense moment. Bullet went through clean, but he's done fighting.
Morrison looked at his depleted crew, his wounded, exhausted, impossible crew, and then at the horizon ahead. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. And in that light, he could see the shapes of the remaining Zeros, circling at a distance, like wolves unsure whether the wounded prey was still dangerous.
6 remaining fighters, and aboard Lazy Lucy, only 2 functioning guns, a dying engine, and a crew held together by willpower alone.
They're not attacking, O'Brien observed. Why aren't they attacking?
Morrison understood. After everything they had witnessed, 6 of their comrades killed, a slow bomber performing miracles, the remaining pilots were afraid. Not of dying, perhaps. Japanese pilots had made peace with death long ago, but afraid of something else. Afraid of the shame of being the next to fall. Afraid of the demon aircraft that killed without dying.
They're waiting to see if we fall on our own, Morrison said. Hoping our engines fail, our fuel runs out. They don't want to fight us anymore. They just want to watch us die.
Can we make it home? O'Brien asked. Tell me the truth, Sam. Can we make it?
Morrison checked his instruments. Fuel, critical. Engine temperature, red zone. Structural integrity, a question mark. Distance to Henderson Field, 83 miles.
I don't know, he admitted, but I know we're not going to give them the satisfaction of watching us give up. He pushed the throttles forward, ignoring the shudder of the starboard engine, ignoring the warning lights, ignoring everything except the distant promise of home.
"Come on, Lucy," he whispered. "One more miracle. Just one more."
For 40 minutes they limped toward home, while the 6 remaining Zeros shadowed them like vultures. Morrison could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting for the moment of weakness that would signal the end. But he refused to give them that moment. He held the yoke with hands that had forgotten how to shake, kept the engines running through sheer force of will, refused to let the impossible finally become the inevitable. At 7:15, one of the Zeros broke formation and began an approach. Morrison's heart seized, but the attack never came. Instead, the fighter pulled alongside Lazy Lucy, close enough that Morrison could see the pilot clearly through the shattered remnants of his cockpit windows. The Japanese pilot was young, impossibly young, barely older than Patty Murphy. His face was pale beneath his flight goggles, his eyes wide with something that looked almost like wonder. For a long moment, he simply stared at the Catalina, at this broken, battered, impossible aircraft that had killed half his squadron and refused to die.
Then, slowly, he raised his hand in a salute. Morrison, operating on instinct, returned it.
The Zero held position for another heartbeat, 2, then banked away, rejoining his comrades. As Morrison watched, the remaining fighters began to turn, heading back toward Rabaul. One by one, they dwindled into the distance until only the empty sky remained.
"They're leaving," O'Brien whispered, disbelief saturating every word. They're letting us go."
They've seen enough, Morrison replied. His voice was hoarse, his throat raw from hours of shouting commands. 6 kills. 6 of their friends, shot down by a slow bomber that should have died in the first 30 seconds. Whatever orders they had, whatever honor demanded, it's not worth it anymore. Not for them.
So we won?
Morrison looked around the cabin, at the blood on the deck, the holes in the fuselage, the wounded men who had fought beyond all reason, at Tanaka, unconscious but breathing, at Goldstein, clutching his broken leg with white-knuckled determination, at Patty Murphy, still at his post despite the shrapnel in his arm, at Washington, covered in oil and hydraulic fluid from his impossible repairs, at Rodriguez, slumped over his gun but still scanning the sky for threats.
We survived, Morrison said quietly. I don't know if that's the same thing.
Landing gear? O'Brien asked.
Destroyed. We're going in on the hull. Brace for impact.
The landing was less a controlled arrival than a controlled crash. Lazy Lucy hit the water hard, her weakened hull groaning in protest, water flooding through the countless holes in her fuselage. She skipped once, twice, then settled into the lagoon with a final, exhausted sigh.
For a moment, there was silence. Then O'Brien laughed, a wild, hysterical sound that broke the tension like a hammer. "We made it," he gasped. "We actually made it."
Morrison slumped in his seat, suddenly too exhausted to move. Through the cracked windscreen, he could see rescue boats racing toward them, sailors standing on deck with expressions of disbelief. They had seen Lazy Lucy approach, this broken, impossible aircraft, trailing smoke and fluid, held together by nothing but stubbornness, and they had expected to recover bodies. Instead, they would find survivors, all 7 of them, wounded but alive. As the rescue crews swarmed aboard, as medics rushed to stabilize the wounded, as officers shouted questions that Morrison was too tired to answer, he reached out and placed his hand on Lazy Lucy's console, feeling the metal beneath his palm, still warm from the engines, still vibrating with the fading echo of her heartbeat.
"Thank you," he whispered. "You beautiful, impossible girl. Thank you for bringing us home." And somewhere in the slowly flooding cockpit, he could swear he heard her answer, a final creak of metal, a last settling sigh, the death rattle of an aircraft that had done what no one believed possible and had nothing left to give. Lazy Lucy would never fly again, but her legend was just beginning.
The intelligence Lazy Lucy brought back changed the course of the Pacific War. The photographs of Rabaul Harbor revealed the full scale of Japanese naval preparations, allowing American commanders to adjust their strategy accordingly. A planned Japanese offensive was disrupted before it began. Supply lines to Guadalcanal remained open, and thousands of American lives were saved.
For their actions, the crew of Lazy Lucy received the highest honors the Navy could bestow. Morrison was awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Catalina pilot to receive it. O'Brien received the Navy Cross, as did Washington and Tanaka. Rodriguez and Goldstein received Silver Stars. Even young Patty Murphy, the 17-year-old radio operator, was decorated for valor.
But the decorations were not what people remembered. What they remembered were the numbers. 6 confirmed kills in a single engagement, 3 additional probables, against 12 of Japan's finest fighters. A slow bomber, a flying whale, a target practice, transformed into the deadliest anti-fighter platform in the Pacific Theater.
"How did you do it?" asked Commander Hayes, debriefing Morrison after a week of recovery. "I've reviewed the reports, the gun camera footage, the statements from your crew. I understand what happened. I just don't understand how." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the lagoon, where the remnants of Lazy Lucy still lay half-submerged, a monument to the impossible. "They saw what they expected to see," he finally said. "A slow bomber, an easy target. They attacked with the tactics they'd trained for, the approaches that had always worked before. And when those tactics failed, they didn't adapt. They just tried harder, faster, more aggressively. By the time they realized we weren't playing by their rules, half of them were dead.
And the other half?
The other half learned something. The same thing I hope everyone learns from this. Morrison turned to face Hayes directly. Never underestimate anyone based on appearances. Never assume that slow means helpless, or that small means weak. The most dangerous enemy is the one you're not taking seriously.
Hayes nodded slowly. The Japanese pilots who survive, our intelligence suggests they've been spreading stories. They're calling you Yurei, the ghost. They're saying the slow bomber cannot be killed because it's already dead, piloted by spirits of vengeance.
Let them believe it, Morrison said, with a faint smile. Fear is a weapon too. And if they're afraid of slow bombers, maybe the next crew to face impossible odds will have a chance.
He stood, preparing to leave, then paused at the door. Commander, what will happen to my crew after we recover?
That depends on you, Morrison. You could have a staff position, training new crews, passing on your tactics. You've earned a rest.
And if I don't want to rest?
Hayes's expression was unreadable. Then there's another Catalina being prepped as we speak. She doesn't have a name yet. And there are missions waiting, dangerous ones, impossible ones. The kind of missions that need a crew that doesn't know how to die. Morrison smiled, a real smile, the first in weeks. Then I'd like to meet her. I think we have unfinished business with the Japanese Empire.
And your crew?
Where I go, they go. We're family now, Commander. The kind of family you don't find anywhere else. He walked out into the tropical sunlight, where the rest of his crew was waiting, bandaged, scarred, forever changed by what they had experienced. O'Brien was telling an exaggerated version of the battle to a group of incredulous Marines. Washington was already examining their new aircraft with a critical eye. Rodriguez was teaching Patty Murphy the finer points of aerial gunnery. Goldstein, on crutches, was sketching trajectory diagrams in the sand. And Tanaka, his arm in a sling, was standing slightly apart, his eyes distant with thoughts he would never fully share.
Well, gentlemen, Morrison announced, who wants to go make some more history?
The cheers that followed echoed across the airfield, carried by the tropical wind to wherever the spirits of the fallen listen. The crew of Lazy Lucy flew together for another 18 months until the tide of war had turned irrevocably against Japan. In that time, they accumulated a record that would never be matched: 47 combat missions, 19 confirmed aerial kills, 4 ships sunk, countless rescues of downed pilots from hostile waters. They flew 3 different Catalinas, each named for someone's grandmother, and lost none of them to enemy action. Their tactics were studied, codified, and taught to new Catalina crews throughout the Pacific. The Morrison Doctrine, as it came to be known, transformed the PBY from a helpless victim into a genuine threat. Japanese pilots learned to approach slow bombers with caution, always wondering if this particular Catalina might be another Lazy Lucy. The war ended in August 1945. The crew gathered one final time at Henderson Field, the same airfield where they had made their impossible return, to say goodbye. "What now?" O'Brien asked, as they stood looking out at the lagoon where the original Lazy Lucy still lay, a rusted monument to their first impossible victory. "What do men like us do when the fighting's over?" "We live," Morrison replied. "That's what we were fighting for, wasn't it? The chance to live." They scattered after that, returning to the lives the war had interrupted, or in some cases, the lives the war had made possible. O'Brien sobered up and became a commercial pilot, flying passengers safely for 30 years without a single incident. Washington, enrolled at MIT on the GI Bill, earned an engineering degree and went on to design aircraft engines for Boeing, engines that powered planes carrying men who had once told him his kind didn't belong in aviation. Rodriguez returned to Texas and opened a shooting range where he trained 2 Olympic gold medalists and countless law enforcement officers. Goldstein became a professor of mathematics at Columbia, publishing papers on probability theory that never mentioned their real-world inspiration. Patty Murphy went back to Minnesota, married his high school sweetheart, raised 6 children, and never told any of them what he had done before his 18th birthday.
Tanaka's story was more complicated. He returned to California to find his family still interned, his property confiscated, his neighbors suspicious, despite his decorations and his honorable discharge. It took years for him to rebuild, years of fighting a different kind of war, against prejudice and ignorance and the casual cruelty of those who couldn't see past the shape of his eyes.
But he persevered, as he had persevered in the skies over the Pacific, and eventually became one of the first Japanese-American judges in the state's history. And Morrison? He tried civilian life for a while. Tried and found it lacking. The sky called to him in a way nothing else could. He joined Pan American World Airways, flying the Pacific routes he had once patrolled for enemies, carrying passengers instead of weapons. On clear nights, he would sometimes gaze out the cockpit windows at the endless ocean below and remember. Remember the fear and the fury. Remember the impossible odds. Remember the men who had trusted him with their lives and the enemies who had underestimated him. Remember Lazy Lucy, the slow bomber that refused to die, and the lesson she had taught him. That the world will always underestimate the unlikely. That speed is not strength, and size is not power. That the most dangerous thing in any fight is the will to survive, and the wisdom to know that survival is not the same as victory. He retired in 1978, moved to a small house overlooking the Pacific, and spent his final years writing letters to the men who had flown with him, and, occasionally, to the Japanese pilots who had survived their encounter with Lazy Lucy. One of them, Kenji Hashimoto, the young pilot who had saluted him in those final moments, became a pen pal and eventually a friend. They met once in 1985, two old men sharing tea and memories on a beach in Hawaii, halfway between the countries that had once tried to destroy each other.
"I have wondered for 40 years," Hashimoto said, his English accented but clear, "how you did it, how a slow bomber killed so many of us. I have read the reports, studied the tactics, analyzed every moment of that battle. I still do not understand."
Morrison smiled, the same smile he had worn in the cockpit of Lazy Lucy, the smile of a man who had touched the impossible and lived to tell about it. "You want to know the secret?" he asked.
Please. There is no secret. We were slow, and you were fast. We were weak, and you were strong. By every measure that matters, you should have killed us in the first minute. Morrison paused, watching the waves roll in, the same waves that had once carried the wreckage of Japanese fighters and the bodies of their pilots. But you made one mistake that cost everything.
What mistake?
You laughed at us. Morrison's eyes were distant, seeing something beyond the horizon. You saw the slow bomber, and you thought, easy kill. You didn't prepare for a real fight because you didn't believe we could give you one. And by the time you realized we could, by the time you understood that slow doesn't mean helpless, it was too late.
Hashimoto was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, and raised his teacup in a toast.
"To Lazy Lucy," he said, "and to the lesson she taught us all."
To Lazy Lucy, Morrison agreed. The slow bomber that killed faster than any fighter. May she rest in peace, and may we never forget what she showed us.
They drank in silence, two old enemies united by respect, as the sun set over the Pacific and the ghosts of the fallen finally, peacefully, faded into history.
Lieutenant Commander Samuel Morrison died on September 12, 2001, one day after the world changed forever. He was 92 years old, the last surviving member of the original Lazy Lucy crew, and he passed in his sleep with his Medal of Honor on the nightstand beside him and a photograph of his crew in his hand.
At his funeral, attended by military officers and aviation historians and a few very old men who had once flown with him, the chaplain read from a letter Morrison had written years earlier, to be opened only after his death.
I have been asked many times what lesson Lazy Lucy taught me. What wisdom I extracted from that impossible day when a slow bomber killed 9 fighters and changed the course of a war. People want tactics, they want strategies, they want secrets they can write down and teach to others.
But the truth is simpler and harder than any tactic. The truth is this.
The world will always underestimate you. It will look at your size, your speed, your resources, and it will decide what you are capable of before you have a chance to prove otherwise. This is not unfair. This is simply human nature. We see what we expect to see, and we prepare only for the threats we believe are real.
Your job, your sacred duty, is to prove them wrong. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with action, with results, with the calm, quiet competence of someone who knows their own worth, regardless of what others believe.
They called Lazy Lucy a flying coffin, a whale, target practice. They laughed when they saw her lumbering through the sky, and 9 of them died, still trying to understand how they had been so wrong.
Never underestimate the unlikely. Never dismiss the underdog. Never assume that slow means helpless or that small means weak, because somewhere out there, right now, someone is looking at an impossible challenge and refusing to accept that it cannot be beaten.
That someone might be you. And if it is, remember Lazy Lucy. Remember that the slow bomber downed 9 zeros. Remember that the crew nobody wanted became the most decorated in the Pacific. Remember that every time the world told us we should die, we chose to live instead.
And remember that the last laugh, the only laugh that matters, belongs to the ones who survive.
The chaplain closed the letter. The bugler played taps, and as the flag was folded and presented to Morrison's family, a flight of aircraft passed overhead in the missing man formation, a tribute to a pilot who had proven 60 years earlier that the impossible is just another word for not yet done.
The slow bomber is gone now, rusted away beneath the waters of the South Pacific. The men who flew her are all dead, their stories preserved only in official records and fading memories. But the lesson remains.
Never laugh at what you don't understand.
Never underestimate the slow, the small, the overlooked.
And never, ever assume that the battle is over just because you think you've already won.
Because somewhere out there, Lazy Lucy is still flying. In the hearts of everyone who was ever told they couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't, and did it anyway.
In the hearts of the misfits, the rejects, the impossible ones.
In the hearts of those who refuse to die.